Welcome to Bright Hope Creations. I'm Kara, and today we are going to put our Easter bunnies to work on a non-Easter project. So we're using How You Been Buttons add-on and the How You Been and Extraordinary Easter, the Simple Stripes portrait in sticky note, guava, and ballet slippers, and the outside in stitched rectangle, the largest one just for some printer paper, and I'm using that to hold my stripes in place. I'm deciding how I'm going to arrange those stripes, and I love this combination of pink and yellow, and especially with Lawn Fawn's colors with this sticky note and ballet slippers and guava. I'm just using my tape runner to adhere each of these stripes to the printer paper, and then I'm going to stamp the sentiment. Now, in hindsight, I would stamp the sentiment onto one of these stripes first and then adhere them to the paper, because when I heat up the embossing powder to melt it, it doesn't react really well with the adhesive, and so it kind of warps it a bit. So what I would do first is stamp it out on that one strip and then adhere all the stripes to the printer paper. But live and learn. So my sentiment is from the How You Been Buttons add-on, and it is "You are cute as a button." I'm using clear ink to stamp that out, and then I'll use some white embossing powder, sprinkle that on, and melt it. And then what I did was just I ripped off the backing, the printer paper that I had put on, and I just added them to a new piece, and it's all flat and nice and ready to go. And so now I can stamp out my other pieces. So this is the How You Been jar and the two Easter bunnies holding that egg from the Extraordinary Easter. So stamping those two out, and then I want some buttons. So from the How You Been Buttons add-on, here is that button grouping for the jar, and then I have the outline button, and I'm going to stamp that once, and then with my acrylic block I'm going to stamp out a bunch of those buttons. I'm using jet black ink on all of these because it is Copic friendly, and I will be using Copics today. Actually, I'm using a combination of colored inks and Copics today. Well, I'll clean off my stamps, and with my acrylic block, I'm going to stamp out a bunch of those buttons. A couple of things here that are interesting. First, I love this tiny little block. It helps me have control over a small stamp, but I like to put the stamp on the edge of the block. That also helps. And then, if you saw, I just dropped my block. Well, I realized that when I'm trying to be real careful stamping these, things go wrong. But when I just don't think about it too hard and it just move from the ink pad to the paper, they stamp real clear. I think after I stopped caring too much, I only had one button that didn't really stamp all the way, but otherwise they came out really nice and clear. Now, How You Been Buttons add-on has a solid button as well, and so I used that to color up these buttons, and I'm using butter, guava, and ballet slippers. Let's start with butter here, and I like this ink formula because once you stamp it on, it smooths out. Actually, it looks smooth right away, but sometimes if it goes on and you feel like it's got some spots from your stamping, it usually smooths right out. So I'm lining up the holes in the middle of the buttons so that I have those left white, but otherwise you can see they just stamp so easily on here. So I did about 10 in yellow and now 10, I think, in ballet slippers. I wasn't sure how many buttons I was going to want, and so I just did a bunch, and I'll have them for later. Now, if you don't want to stamp them out individually and cut them out individually, then you could stamp them on the stripes. So instead, make white stripes in the Simple Stripes portrait and just stamp those across and color them in this way. I have to say though, it did not take me long to cut all of these buttons out. You might you might think it did, but they're circles. They were easy to line up and easy to cut. All right, so I'm kind of counting here, see how many I have, and I think I stopped there. All right, so clean that off, and it's time to start putting in some of the shading. And so I'm using Copic markers for this. They color right over that ink, and this is a Y21 and a Y00 just to blend that up. Not a lot of shading here. You really don't even have to shade if you don't want to, but I like a little bit of shadow in there. And so this is the RV21 for the ballet slippers and RV00 to blend that in. And then with the guava, I'm going to use the RV25 and blend that in with the RV23. After that, I have a gel pen and I'm going to add some highlights on the buttons. Do you have a button jar at home? I do not, but I do remember my mom had one and I loved looking through all those buttons. There's so many different varieties and some had unique shapes and colors. All right, let's move on to our button jar. And I have that ballet slipper ink again, and I'm going to stamp one, and then I'm going to use some buttons that I'd already cut out. And you can see I was kind of playing with, should I do just solid? Should I do lines with solids? Yeah. So you can see my buttons there, but I'm using those to hide the other buttons, using them as a mask so that I can stamp out those colors in the buttons that are in the background. I think button jars are it's kind of funny because they're like a collection, but a tiny one, right? So my mom used to sew our clothes, and so she used to put great buttons, or fun buttons, on my clothes. I remember these great little frog buttons that she put on the straps of this little green and yellow romper or jumper that I had. Oh, I don't know. It brings back great memories. Well, onto our yellow buttons, and this is that butter ink. And you can see how easy it is just to cover up those different buttons with a circle and then stamp right on over them. Now I'm deciding what button should be what color because I have 3 colors, and so some of them are going to overlap a little bit. And so here is my yellow button going there, and I didn't cover up that yellow button above it. I didn't think it needed it. Now onto that guava, and some of the little stitching around the edges of the button, you can see stamp out white. You don't see it with the lighter colors, but you do with that guava, and that is an easy fix if you don't want it. I mean, actually, I think it looks nice, but you can just color over that with a Copic marker. The RV20s work really well with the guava color, and so 23 or 25, depending on your shading. I have to say, I really enjoyed coloring these buttons with the solid stamp over the line stamp. It just was a fun way to color, and it was an easy, quick shading because I already had the full solid color on those buttons. All right, now that the buttons are all stamped, I'm using that white gel pen to add some highlights again. And then it's time to move on to those bunnies. So I'm using a W1, that's a warm gray, and finding all the places that I want shadows or shading. And usually it's where the bunnies, where there's a crease or something, like under the neck, or you can see by the egg there that he is kind of behind that, so he would have a shadow. And I'm going to use that even though I'm not using the eggs, I'm using those shadows. Now I'm going to darken up those places that I decided were going to be shaded, and this is the W3 to just, I'm not shading a lot, you can see, just a small amount, because I want them to be essentially white bunnies, but with some shadow. I like to put a little bit of shading around their eyes just to make those look like they're a little further back than their noses or their snouts. And so that's why I put a little shading there on those eyes. Now coming in and blending that up a little bit with that W1 again. And then I'll further blend that out with the W00. But sometimes when I do this, I feel like I'm getting a gray bunny instead of a white bunny with shading. So I like to come in with the 0, which is the colorless blender, and just kind of diffuse that color a little bit in the centers or where I feel that the bunny should be the whitest. I actually decided to go a little bit of a different direction and have this be a bit of a brown tone. And that's just by adding this E43 to some of the shading. And it just gives a little different cast to the shadows and makes it look warmer, I think, even than the warm gray. All right, coming in with the pink ears, cheeks, and noses with the RV21, and then I'll lighten that up with the RV00. I'm just going right over the top of those cheeks to kind of diffuse that color a little bit, blend out those ears, and then diffuse those cheeks a little bit more with the 0. I decided I wanted to deepen those shadows, so I have this W6 and just touching it into just a few of those edges there. All right, now I can take those coordinating dies and cut everything out. And here's my jar and my bunnies and all those beautiful buttons. All right, now I want to shade in my button jar. I wasn't sure as I was coloring everything how I wanted that shaded, so I waited. And now I know I'm going to use some cool grays under those buttons and in between them. I went from a C1 to a C2 for my shading. I'm not shading all the way to the edge of the jar. I feel like that gives it a kind of the look of a thicker glass around it. And I'll do some shading at the top of the jar as well to show the rim with the way we would screw on that lid, and then down the edges of the jar, just like I did on the bottom, leaving some space in between the outside of the jar just to show the thickness, that there's some thickness to that glass. So I used a C0 and now a C2 to show some of those lines on the glass. Now with this jar all shaded, I'm ready to move on to those bunnies and using them for a different purpose. So there they are, Easter ready with their Easter egg, but I'm just cutting most of that Easter egg off, and then I'm trimming around their little arms, and that frees up their arms to hold other things. And I think this is a great way to repurpose some seasonal stamps in a different way. So these little bunnies could hold lots of things because they're holding the Easter egg. So if you look through your stamps and see something holding something, then chances are you could free up that arm and have it hold something else. I'm taking off some of that Easter egg, but I'm going to keep part of it on so that I have something to use to glue onto the back of my jar. Now you could skip this next step, but a lot of times when I'm cutting right to the edge of a black line, I like to take a brush tip marker and go over that edge so that you don't see any white there. But again, really probably no one would really see it anyway, but it's just one of those little details. I like to go from the back of the image with my brush tip marker so that if I came from the front, I could accidentally touch that image with my marker and get some ink on there. And so I like to go from the back of the image. All right, taking a little glue and putting it on the Easter egg, and then slipping that little arm in front, and everything else goes behind the jar. And there he is, all set. And then my other little guy taking some glue onto the Easter egg and then slipping his little arm, kind of flip that arm forward so that it was easy to slip him behind the jar. With the glue, it's easy to adjust him a little bit before that glue dries. Make sure I have him positioned just the way I want him. And when I use the How You Bend jar, I always like to use a piece of acetate and cut that jar out of the acetate. And how am I going to put this acetate over the jar? Well, you find whatever is covering the jar, and in this case, it's just those two little arms. But it's enough. With that glue, it's enough to keep that jar or the acetate securely on the paper. So I just put a little bit of glue, and you could see on the side, I dabbed some glue on an extra little button there, and I'm using a very small amount with the stylus, just touching underneath their arm, and now their arms can hold on to that acetate as well. And so now I have a glass jar. It's a shiny glass jar, and it was really easy to do. Another little detail that I like to do sometimes is shade my sentiment. And so I'm using a Copic marker, this is the RV25, to darken up around one side of my letters. And because the sentiment is small, the ink from my marker is getting all over my white sentiment. But that's an easy fix. I take that zero colorless blender and touch that to the tops of all of my letters, and I can get that pink off of the white. So it kind of cleans it all up, but I still have my little border or shadow on the sides of my letters. Now with all those details taken care of, it's time to start putting everything together. I'm adhering the jar and bunnies to my background, and then I've got to decide where I want my buttons. And I kind of decided ahead of time that I was going to put them on the rows of yellow. And I'm putting them in an order. So I have my guava, ballet slippers, and butter buttons. And I'm just going to make that my pattern. So I'm starting that top row with the guava, and then my second row down, I'm going to use the pink to start. Oh no, I'm going to start with yellow, and then the guava and the pink. And then my bottom row is going to start with the pink to yellow to guava. Now for another cute alternative, you could use the Hop to It washi tape, and I taped that onto sticky note cardstock, and I think that would look cute too for the yellow stripes. But back to our buttons, I'm just going to adhere them all with my adhesive. And as I'm looking at this coming together, I love how the ink is really coordinating with the cardstock. All right, final button added, and now all I need to do is adhere this to a 4¼ by 5½ inch note card, and then this card is all done. Well, there you have it. Bunnies holding the jar, as cute as a button. It really is. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video today and that it inspired you to maybe look at your stamps and use them for different purposes. Thanks for watching and have a great day. Bye.